This is Tell Me What to Read, powered by Booktopia. I'm Nick Wasiliev, and today we are continuing our series of podcasts around Booktoberfest, our biggest festival of the year where we celebrate the most exciting new and upcoming books. In today's episode, Ben Hunter sits down with the one and only Victoria Hannan to discuss her brand new book, Marshmallow. Check the show notes for timestamps for the interview, and if you are enjoying our show, drop us a review on Apple Podcasts or a like on Spotify. Let us know what you think of the show. Now over to Ben's interview with Victoria Hannan, author of Marshmallow, which you can order in the description right now from booktopia.com.au as part of our Booktoberfest campaign.
Hi, I'm Ben Hunter, Booktopia's fiction category manager, and I'm seated across from Victoria Hannan, who is an author and photographer living on unceded Wurundjeri country. Her first novel, Kokomo, won the VPLA, the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Unpublished Manuscript. And she has a second novel now, which is also stupendous. It's called Marshmallow. Victoria, thanks for being with me.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'll ask a big and grandiose question to start. You're a creative person. You're a writer and photographer. Why write fiction? Where did the compulsion come from, I guess, and where do you want it to take you?
I feel like I've always been a writer first and a photographer second. There's definitely been points in my career where the photography has been more prominent, but I've always been drawn to writing fiction. And I think I started out writing short stories and then evolved into writing novels because and I guess it's the same compulsion with photography, but I've just always loved being able to tell a story. Mm-hmm. And I think writing fiction obviously opens up so many more worlds where you can tell that story, whereas with photography, often you just have the story that's in front of you.
Your first book, Kokomo, that was about a strained mother-daughter relationship, which in part was fractured by this catastrophic loss. And the new book, Marshmallow, it is a book about 5 friends who are a year on from a catastrophic loss. Their lives have been just turned upside down. I know you're not a stranger to loss in your personal life, which you don't have to discuss on the podcast, but I'm curious to know, I guess, why grief and loss are at the forefront of the fiction, and what you want to interrogate through that.
A lot of it, I think, is trying to understand my own feelings. So as you mentioned, I have had some loss in my life, and sometimes when you're in it, it can be really hard to see and understand what it is that you're feeling. And so I feel like by writing about it, it's a good way to unpack that. And I think one of the things I wanted to do with Marshmallow particularly was look at all the different facets and sort of colours and shapes of grief. And I feel like that's really hard to do when you're just kind of writing about one character. And so in writing about the traumatic experience from 5 people's characters, I was able to almost give each one of them a different facet of my own grief and my own feelings at the time, and explore and kind of play out that grief and that scenario with each of those people to try and understand it better myself.
Well, shall we have a viewing of the rainbow of grief then? Shall we have a look at each of these characters? Could you introduce them to us?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book opens with a guy named Al. He's in his mid-30s, and I think one of the things that I wanted to explore with him was the fact that a traumatic experience in the present and the way that you react to that can be coloured by experiences you've had in the past. And so for Al, all of his past traumas are sort of piling on top of each other, and it's really affecting the way that he is coping with the grief that he's experiencing. And he's so deep in it that he's unable to see that that's what's happening. And I think one of the things that we often don't talk about with grief is all of your lived experiences from the past can affect how you're grieving. It's kind of expressed normally in this way that you would go through the kind of Kubler-Ross model, which is the anger, the denial, the bargaining, the depression, the acceptance. But it never actually works in that order. It's always coloured and kind of changed and reshaped by all of your previous experiences and how you've dealt with those in the past. So that was something that I wanted to explore with Al. And one of the ways that he is or isn't coping with the kind of loss that they've experienced is by kind of, he's quite angry and he's drinking too much.
Yes.
And he's just not dealing with anything at all. He's kind of putting his head in the sand a bit. And that's really affecting his relationship with his partner, Claire. When we meet her in the novel, she's on her way to Sydney for a job interview that she hasn't told anybody else about. And she is sort of drowning under the weight of her partner's grief and is doing what she's done in the past when things get tough, and that she's considering running away, hence the job interview in Sydney. And so her journey in this novel is trying to grapple with whether she wants to stay or whether she wants to go and what is worth staying for.
Reading Claire, and I don't know if other readers will have this, but or is it just me projecting myself into the novel with Al as my avatar, right? Like, because the first chapter is Al, and he's like, it's a really striking chapter. And as you kind of mentioned, he's really going through the motions. Is this like distraught, angry, straight male, and as a reader, like, I love Claire, and she has a complex process of her own, and her whole life is on a precipice, and her chapters are really interesting. But Al, like, I kept reading Claire through an Al lens, through his longing, because I just felt that really hard, which is like a good thing.
Yeah, and I feel like one of the really interesting things in writing a relationship from both perspectives is that you're shifting perspectives, so you're constantly seeing the other person through each other's lenses, but I'm the one controlling them. So it's just this weird experience of like, here's two people that I've grown to love, who I know love each other, but yet I'm just sort of pulling them apart and sort of fracturing their relationship. It's a very strange thing to do with one's time.
Perhaps Ev is the one that is like the closest to what feels like healing or regenesis. She's a bit of a breath of fresh air.
Yeah, I think she was really important to have in there as someone who had gone through the motions of going to therapy and trying to heal. And I think she's doing a lot better than she thinks she is. I think she thinks she's struggling, but actually she's the one that is showing up every day for her friends who aren't doing as well as her. She's a teacher and she's going to school every day and showing up for those kids. And she's going to therapy and she's just trying to get through kind of the worst parts of it, and she's doing pretty well. And I think having that person there who's sort of the guiding light for the rest of them is really important, because I wanted, while the novel is very sad, I wanted it to also feel hopeful.
She's the one that goes on the date, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and that's also like just a tiny element of something new, something that like is life beyond this trauma, which is like when you read, particularly say Nathan. I'll let you talk about Nathan in a moment. He's just in stasis. Do you want to talk about Annie and Nathan? I can't talk about them without crying. So like,
sure. So Annie and Nathan are, and I don't want to give too much away, but this book is about the death of a child, and Annie and Nathan are the parents of that child, and they were definitely the hardest ones to write because their grief and their loss is almost physical. So kind of you feel it inside their bodies. And as you said, Nathan has sort of everything's stopped. So on paper, he's an incredibly successful person. He comes from great privilege. He's always had everything handed to him. But what I wanted to explore with him was someone who comes from that great privilege, but then has something taken away from him. And it's the biggest thing you could take from someone. But he's lost something for the first time in his life, and it's something huge. And so how does he grapple with those feelings of loss after having everything that he's ever wanted?
Yeah.
And he deals with it by just doing nothing except playing solitaire on the toilet at work. Yeah,
he has all of this, like it's his firm. He has this incredible economic privilege, but it might as well be for nothing because discarded Joy's life.
He's squandering his life away.
And Annie has the most profound little snippet moments in the book. I've selected one. Would you like to read it?
Yeah,
just to give the
absolutely.
listener a taste.
Annie sat on the sofa and picked at the dirt under her fingernails. She took an unopened envelope from the coffee table. She could tell from its thickness, from the handwritten address, that it was a card that would say sorry or offer a prayer or best wishes or love. The last thing she needed was more love. She had so much of it coursing inside her that sometimes she thought she might burst. People talk about the explosion of love you feel when your baby's born, but never about where it's supposed to go when it dies. There should be a dumping station or a sludge pit. She used the corner of the envelope to scrape the last of the dirt from under her thumbnail and placed it down on the sofa next to her. The house ticked in the evening quiet, metal cooling, wood shifting. The air around her thick like cloud. Nearby a fly buzzed and banged against the window. She could have got up and set it free, but instead she watched it flit desperately from one side of the window to the other, banging and banging and banging in search of freedom. The sound of her phone ringing jolted her. It was almost dark now somehow. She'd lost whole days like this, just sitting, time vanishing just as he did. Her phone screen flashed urgently. Turak. She didn't answer. She just let it go to voicemail, turned her phone over. She might listen to the message later. She might forget. She looked around her. In the near darkness, she could just make out the shapes of furniture. An armchair, the kitchen bench, the dining table. She wanted to stand, to get a glass of water, to walk up the stairs, brush her teeth, get into bed. But she didn't move. She just sat as the dim room turned black, as the sharp corners and edges became impossible to discern from the air.
Incredible. How do you dream up moments like that, and then how do you select and curate them for a book like this?
I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that question. Right. I feel like I wrote the first draft of this book in 2019, and then obviously in 2020 the world changed quite a bit.
Yep.
And then my mum passed away at the end of 2020. And 2 months after that, I sat down and started writing this book again. And I feel like so much of it was just written in this sort of grief-fueled fugue state that I can't remember half of the actual writing process of what went into it. And I've gone back through some of my emails to see like when I sent it to my agent and when I sent it to my publisher and when the edits happened. But the actual details of how I wrote this book, I don't know. And I wonder if that's my brain just like protecting myself a little bit, because I think in writing this book, I was like trying to run from my own grief a little bit.
Or maybe just like excise some of it.
Yeah.
Put it into fiction.
Yeah, I actually don't know how I wrote those moments. There are a few little bits here and there that were taken from, and I don't write diaries, but in the kind of 6 weeks before my mum died, I wrote a diary every day of just things I was feeling and things I was seeing. And I feel like that was quite helpful in kind of conjuring some of those feelings that these people are having. But yeah, the actual like process of how I put it all together, no idea.
Were there a lot of words that you just got out and then left on the proverbial cutting room floor?
Yeah, there were definitely some bits that were a little too personal to me, or parts that just kind of didn't work in the structure of the book, and also some feelings which I had written while I was going through it, which didn't really make sense to, I think, anybody but me. Like certain images, I remember I had one very specific image of feeling like I was being held by a gloved hand, and I wrote that in there, and everyone that read it was like, "What do you mean?" I was like, "I don't know, it's just a feeling that I had one day." And it's very specific and it doesn't make sense, but it was just what I felt in one particular day. And I remember exactly where I was when I thought that.
The action of this novel takes place almost exactly 1 year on from the death that turns all these lives upside down. Was there a lot of work to get to pinpointing the action there, or was that always consciously your choice?
I knew that I wanted to set it a year away from it to give them the characters a little bit of space. I feel like if I set the novel at the time that it happened and focused the action around the actual traumatic experience, I think it would have been, I mean, it's already quite heavy, but I think it would have been too much. And even now, you never actually see the full kind of trauma that they experience. You just get snippets of it that sort of build through the novel. And that was a very deliberate thing because I didn't want to burden people too much with the same trauma that these people have experienced.
No.
And I feel like the beautiful thing about time is that it makes the thing that has traumatized you feel a little bit further away. And I think that distance for these characters and for me to be able to write about them was really important. And I think there is something about an anniversary. I don't know why humans kind of hold on to that, but there felt something quite important about that 1 year anniversary. And I know that when I've lost people in my life, you do sort of have feelings that build up to that particular date. And I think there's one moment where Ev is talking to her mum on the phone, and her mum is saying it is like the build up to it will often be worse than the actual day because it's just another day, really. Yeah. But yeah, I felt that all of the characters were very aware when they would look at the day and realize that the anniversary was coming up. It was definitely bringing some feelings to the surface.
The other thing I've completely failed to highlight in this podcast to date is that like this book is funny, and you might not be rolling out of your chair laughing, but I think the severity of the action or the subject matter brings out this, like I call it like a pure comedy vein, where the things that the author, looking through the eyes of the characters, just zooms in on, just become absurd and ridiculous and hilarious. And whether that's Al like having a gripe against the people who wear their lanyards to work, like or outside of the office, or Annie's ripped up garden bed, or Nathan's discarded sourdough husk getting pecked apart by pigeons. Like it's simultaneously like the saddest thing in the universe, that ripped up garden bed, that husk, that carcass of a sourdough. But it's inherently kind of funny at the same time. Is that just how grief is? Is it just so intense that it's kind of funny?
I think it is for me, and I definitely I don't know, it's almost something so ridiculously awful about it that you have to laugh every so often. And I remember the day that my mum died was Melbourne Cup Day. We were in Adelaide, but it was Melbourne Cup Day, and all of the nurses at the hospice were wearing silly little hats. And it was like the worst day of my life, but that was quite funny and surreal. And there's just, I don't know, I think sometimes when something is so awful, and at least maybe it's just my personality, but I will, when I hear something terrible, sometimes I accidentally laugh. Like there's just, sometimes you have to find funny things and find some kind of lightness or some kind of joke in order for the most awful thing to just feel even 0.5% less awful. And I think that's what I wanted to show in this book as well, is that sometimes grief is funny and sometimes it's annoying. Sometimes you wake up in the morning and you go, oh God, not this again.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's part of life, and life is funny.
I guess human inconsistencies are just inherently funny, and grief is a normal human fallacy. This book is like an incredible achievement to like distill it and bring it to the page. Do you have aspirations for Marshmallow as a thing that readers will go and take and use to read, or is the job done for you? Do you want some distance from it?
I think I need some distance from it a little bit, because it was really hard to write, and grief is hard to talk about, I think, but it's also important to talk about. And so it's this hard sort of balancing act of like, writing this book helped me, and I hope that reading it will help other people. But at the same time, I don't want anything to do with it.
Yeah.
But I do, because I'm proud of it, but also get it away from me.
Yeah, well said. I'll end this on a lighter note. Is there one book or one author that you universally recommend to other people, just in general?
That's a really hard question. The book that I often return to when I want to remember how much I love books is Commonwealth by Anne Patchett. I think she's brilliant. She's funny. She manages to pack so much into one sentence, and in that book you get an entire lifetime of a blended family who have experienced some trauma, and look at how they've kind of bounced back and forth and come in and out of each other's lives for 30 years. And it's an incredible achievement, that book, and I love it, and I think everyone should read it.
Your book is Marshmallow, and it's published by Hachette, and it is available now from Booktopia. Victoria Hannan, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much to Victoria Hannan. You can find links to all books mentioned in the description today, and if you are enjoying our show, you can drop us a review on Apple Podcasts or a like on Spotify. Wherever you are listening to our show, let us know what you think. Booktoberfest is our biggest campaign of the year, running until the end of October. Head over now to check out the best of new and exciting books coming out in 2022. We'll catch you for our next episode on Thursday, but until then, thanks for listening and never stop reading.